In Glenwood Springs, Colorado, the winter of 1977 settled hard and early. The Garfield County Jail sat in the cold, like any other county building, brick, functional, unremarkable. Inside, the corridors were quiet at night. A duty officer made his rounds. A light burned somewhere down the hall. The cells held their usual population of men waiting on hearings, men serving short sentences, men with nothing much to do but wait. One cell held Theodore Bundy. He had been in Colorado custody for nearly a year by then. He had already escaped once, in the summer, from a courthouse window in Aspen. He had been free for 6 days before they found him and brought him back. Now he was here, in Garfield County, awaiting trial on a murder charge. He had been losing weight deliberately. He had been reading. He had been listening to the sounds of the building at night. He had also been working at a seam in the ceiling of his cell quietly for weeks. On the night of December 30th, the jail was as still as it ever got. The temperature outside had dropped well below freezing. The roads heading south were long and dark. Somewhere far away, in a sorority house on a Florida university campus, young women were preparing to ring in the new year. They did not know his name. They had no reason to. That is where this story begins, in the quiet before the record turns. Chapter 1. The Garfield County Jail. Welcome back to the Bedside Historian. Or perhaps this is your first time here, in which case, welcome. I'm glad you found your way. Wherever you are listening from tonight, I hope the room around you is quiet and the hour is soft. If you have a moment before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. I always love to know. And if this kind of slow, dark storytelling is what you come here for, consider subscribing and leaving a like. It helps more than you might think, and it means I can keep making these for you. Tonight we are going to Colorado. It is the winter of 1977. The mountains are deep in snow, and inside a county jail in a small river town, a man is lying on a cot in the late hours, looking up at his ceiling, and thinking very carefully about the weeks ahead. Let's begin. Assetant, the town of Glenwood Springs sits where the roaring Fort River meets the Colorado River, in a canyon cut so deep that in winter the sun barely clears the ridgeline before mid-morning. The canyon walls are pale sandstone, streaked with mineral brown and the grey of old frost. The Colorado River runs low and cold through November and December, its surface dark and slow between banks of crusted ice. In the evenings, the temperature dropped sharply. By midnight it was well below freezing. The town pulled its shutters and settled in. Glenwood Springs was, and is, a small community. It had motels, a few restaurants, a hot springs pool that drew visitors in the warmer months, a main street with the particular quietness of mountain towns in winter. The county seat for Garfield County, it held the county courthouse and the Garfield County Jail, a building that had not been designed with escape in mind, not because security was especially tight, but because nothing in the building's modest architecture suggested it needed to be. It was a working jail in a small western county. The men inside it were mostly local. Their cases were mostly unremarkable. Theodore Robert Bundy had been transferred to the Garfield County Jail in late 1977. He was being held there awaiting trial on charges related to the murder of Karen Campbell, a nurse from Michigan who had been killed in January 1975 at the Wildwood Inn in Snowmass Village. The case against him was serious. The evidence, while not overwhelming, was enough to bring him to trial. Bundy, who had been trained as a lawyer and who had followed his own cases with close and detailed attention, understood exactly what he was facing. He had reason to be afraid of Colorado. He had also, by this point, reason to know that fear could be managed, that walls could be studied, and that no building was quite as solid as it appeared from inside. He had already escaped once. That first escape had come in June, from the Pitkin County Courthouse in Aspen, where he had been brought for a hearing in the Campbell murder case. He had jumped from a second-floor window of the courthouse law library, landed in an alley and run. He had been free for 6 days in the mountains around Aspen before being caught, shivering and disoriented, near the town of Vale Pass. It had not been a sophisticated escape. He had been cold and hungry and poorly prepared, and he had been recaptured without much difficulty. But it had happened. A man in custody had gone out a window and disappeared into the mountains. And when they brought him back and transferred him to Glenwood Springs to be kept under closer watch, Bundy began to look at his new surroundings the way he had looked at the courthouse window, as a problem with a solution. The Garfield County Jail was housed in a building that also contained, on the upper floors, the living quarters of the jail's chief jailer, Willard Delaney, and his wife. This arrangement was not unusual for small county jails of the era. The jailer and his family lived in the building, close enough to respond quickly if something happened, and their presence was considered part of the security. The building was old. It had been built in a time when such configurations were practical and common. The ceilings of the cells below had their own logic of pipes and beams, and above them ran a network of crawl spaces and utility passages that connected the residential floors to the building's systems. Bundy's cell was in the lower section of the jail. He had, in the way that prisoners often do, become deeply acquainted with the dimensions of his world. He knew the sounds the building made at different hours. He knew the routines of the staff, when they made rounds, how long they lingered, when the building fell fully quiet. He had been given access to a law library, partly because he was representing himself in aspects of his case, and partly because the courts had established that defendants in his position had certain rights to legal resources. He spent hours in that library. He was also, by the fall of 1977, spending a great deal of time in his cell, reading, thinking, and losing weight. The weight loss was deliberate. He reduced what he ate. He exercised in ways that thinned his frame rather than built it. He wanted to be smaller than he had been. He had identified a light fixture in the ceiling of his cell, and beyond it, a gap in the ceiling structure where the fixture had been imperfectly sealed. The gap led into a crawl space. The crawl space, he had determined by careful listening and patient investigation, connected to the upper parts of the building. The passage was narrow. He needed to be narrower too. He had begun working at the edges of the ceiling opening during the quieter hours of the night. He worked slowly, incrementally, so that nothing would look different on casual inspection. A jailer doing rounds at 3 in the morning with a flashlight was not going to notice small changes in a ceiling fixture if nothing looked dramatically wrong. Bundy was careful not to make anything look dramatically wrong. The weeks of November passed. December came in cold. The river ran darker. The ridgelines above the canyon went white and stayed white. Inside the jail, the heat came from a system that worked adequately, but not generously. The cells were cool at night. The corridors held a particular kind of institutional chill, that specific flat cold of a building that heats its common spaces but not its margins, where the air near the floor is always slightly colder than the air near the ceiling, and where the warmth, when it comes from proximity to pipes and from the simple fact of bodies occupying enclosed spaces. The food in the jail was what jail food was in 1977 in a small Colorado county, plain, adequate, and predictable. Coffee in the mornings, dark and not especially good. Bread, eggs on some mornings, potatoes in various forms. Soup that was made from what was available. Meat a few times a week. The diet was not designed to satisfy. It was designed to sustain. Men ate it because it was what there was. Bundy ate less of it than he had before. The staff noticed he had grown thinner, but thinning was not a crime, and there was no particular protocol for a prisoner who chose to eat less. He was not visibly ill. He was not requesting medical attention. He was simply smaller than he had been. He was also reading law. He had files in his cell, legal papers, case notes, transcripts. He was engaged with his defense. This was not unusual. He was known to be an active participant in his own legal situation, sometimes to the frustration of the attorneys around him. The legal work gave him a reason to be awake at unusual hours, a reason to have papers and materials, a reason to move around the cell in ways that might otherwise seem restless or suspicious. Christmas came and went quietly inside the Garfield County Jail, whatever the holiday looked like in the facility. And it would not have looked like much, a small institutional acknowledgement of the season, perhaps a slightly different meal, perhaps a few cards from the chaplain's office. It came and went without incident. Bundy remained in his cell. The staff rotated their shifts. The building held its cold and its silence. By the last days of December, he had widened the opening in the ceiling enough. He had tested it. He knew it would admit him. He had also, over weeks of careful listening, established that there were hours in the night when no one was moving in the residential quarters above, when the building was as close to empty of attention as it was going to get. He had identified a path through the crawl space that he believed would bring him out into the upper level of the building, where Willard Delaney and his wife had their living quarters. He did not know exactly what he would find above. He knew the general geography. He knew the sounds. He was going to have to move quickly and silently once he was in the ceiling, and he was going to have to come down through the apartment without waking anyone. The plan was not elaborate. It did not have many moving parts. There was no accomplice, no outside assistance, no vehicle waiting. He would get out of his cell, move through the ceiling, come down through the apartment, and walk out of the building and into the night. After that, he would improvise. He had escaped once by improvising, and he had failed, but he had also learned from that failure. He would not stay in the mountains this time. He would move south. He would put as much distance as possible between himself and Glenwood Springs before the morning shift arrived and found his cell empty. December 30th, 1977. The town was quiet. The new year was 2 days away. The temperature outside was deep below freezing. The Colorado River ran in darkness through the canyon it had made over centuries, indifferent to the town on its bank, indifferent to the jail sitting in the cold above it, indifferent to the man lying on a cot inside that jail, listening to the buildings settle around him, waiting for the hour when the sounds overhead had stopped entirely and the night was as still as it was going to get. The ceiling above him held the last obstacle. He prepared for it across weeks of careful, patient work. He had made himself smaller. He had learned the building's rhythms. He had waited through November and through December, through the short days and the long frozen nights, through the Christmas holiday and past it, until the moment was as close to right as a moment in a county jail could be. He was going to go up through the ceiling of his cell. He was going to move through the dark above. He was going to come down into a stranger's apartment in the middle of the night, and then he was going to walk south into the American winter, with no money and no plan beyond the direction of travel, toward a warmth and a freedom and a violence that were all still, at that moment, weeks away. For now, the cell was still. The building was still. The river ran cold in the canyon below. He lay on his cot and waited. Chapter 2. A Hole in the Ceiling. Chusbor. The building had its own sounds at night. Every building does. There is the sound a structure makes when the temperature outside drops far enough that the wood and metal in its frame contract slightly. A low, irregular tick and creak that has no rhythm and no source you could point to. There is the sound of a heating system working at reduced capacity through the coldest hours, the distant breath of it moving through pipes, the occasional clank of expansion in metal that has been warm and is cooling. There is the sound of a building occupied by sleeping people, which is not silence but is close to it, a layered quiet made of slow breath and the small unconscious movements of bodies at rest, filtered down through floors and ceilings until it reaches the cells below as nothing more than the faintest sense of presence. Theodore Bundy had been listening to those sounds for weeks. He knew the building's rhythms the way a person who has been confined in one place for long enough always comes to know them. The shift change sounds, the footstep patterns, the particular quality of the silence that settled over the Garfield County Jail in the deep middle of the night, after the last rounds had been made and before the early morning movement began. There was a window in that silence, not wide, but wide enough. He had identified it. He had tested the ceiling opening again in recent nights, carefully, without making noise, satisfying himself that it would work. He had lost the weight he needed to lose. He had prepared as much as a man in a cell can prepare. December 30th fell on a Friday. The jail was staffed at its ordinary overnight level. There was no particular reason for heightened attention. Bundy had not given them reason to watch him more closely in recent days. He had been calm, cooperative in the surface ways that mattered, present at meals, quiet in his cell. Nothing had looked wrong. He waited until the building had fully settled into its late-night state. The sounds above him had gone still. The heating system murmured through its pipes and then fell to its minimum register. The corridor outside his cell held the particular flat quiet that came only after midnight, when the duty officer had completed rounds and returned to the front of the building and the cells were left to their own darkness. He got up from his cot. The ceiling fixture was directly above. He had worked at its edges over many nights, loosening the material around it in increments so small that nothing was visible to a casual eye. Now he reached up and moved it aside. The gap above was dark. The crawl space beyond it smelled of old insulation, of dust that had not been disturbed in years, of the dry cold that accumulates in the unheated spaces inside a building's body. He reached his arms through first, then his head, then worked his shoulders through the opening. He had been right about the weight. He fit. Barely, but he fit. The crawl space was low and narrow. Moving through it required pressing his body flat against the structure of the floor above him and dragging himself forward on his elbows. The insulation was dry and fibrous, and it clung to his clothes and his hair. The cold up here was sharper than in the cell below. Outside the building's walls, the temperature had fallen to somewhere around 0 Fahrenheit. The crawl space was not that cold, but it held the chill of a place that has never been warmed by a fire or a body or a lamp. He moved through it carefully, placing each movement with attention to sound. A creak in the wrong place, a knock of his knee against a beam, a sudden shift of his weight that vibrated through the floor above. Any of those things could wake someone. He had established through weeks of listening that the crawl space connected to the upper residential level of the building, where Willard Delaney and his wife lived in the jailer's quarters. What he could not know in advance with certainty was the exact configuration of what he would find when he came down. He knew the building's exterior geography. He knew roughly which rooms were which based on the sounds he had mapped. He knew that the Delaneys slept at night and that their sleeping hours followed a predictable pattern. He was going to have to trust that the pattern held tonight. He moved through the dark above the jail for what sources later suggested was an hour or more. The distance was not great in physical terms. The difficulty was in moving silently through a confined and unfamiliar space in complete darkness, navigating by feel and by the mental map he had built from listening. He found the point where the crawl space gave access to the upper floor. He came down. He was inside the jailer's apartment. He stood still for a long moment. The apartment was dark and quiet. He could hear breathing from behind a closed door, slow, steady, the deep rhythm of people fully asleep. He did not go toward that door. He moved through the apartment in the direction of the exit, picking his way through the shapes of furniture in the dark, moving with the particular careful slowness of a person who knows that a single knocked object, a chair leg catching on a rug, a glass shifting on a table, could end everything. He found the way out. He went through it and into the cold Colorado night. The temperature outside hit him immediately. He was not dressed for serious cold, not dressed the way you would dress if you were planning to survive a night below 0 in the Rocky Mountain winter with nowhere to go. He had what he had been wearing in the cell, ordinary clothes, not heavy enough for this. The air was still. The town was asleep. The streets of Glenwood Springs at that hour on the morning of December 31st held almost no one. He moved away from the jail building and into the town. In the days and years that followed, investigators and journalists pieced together his movements across the first hours of that escape with imperfect precision. What is established is that he did not linger in Glenwood Springs. He needed transportation. He had no money to speak of, or very little. He eventually located a car, and he drove it. The car broke down or was otherwise unreliable, as stolen vehicles often are, and his first hours of freedom involved the particular misery of being intensely cold and in motion through a landscape that offered no shelter and very little in the way of human activity at that hour. He made it to the bus station at some point in the early hours, or found another way to begin moving east and south. The specific mechanics of how he got from the canyon town to the Colorado interior have never been entirely clear in the public record. But what is clear is that he was moving, that he was putting distance between himself and the jail, and that he was not heading for the mountains this time. He had learned from the first escape. The mountains had nearly killed him. The mountains were where they had found him, cold and ragged and confused after 6 days. He was not going back to the mountains. He was going south. He was going to warm weather and anonymity, and the long flat grids of American cities where a thin man with a forgettable face could disappear into the ordinary movement of strangers. The jail staff discovered his cell empty when the morning shift arrived. The cell was undisturbed in every way except for what was above it, the displaced ceiling fixture, the gap in the ceiling, the evidence of weeks of quiet and patient work. There was no Bundy in the cell. There was no Bundy in the building. The crawl space above told the story of how he had done it, but by the time anyone was reading that story, the author had been gone for hours. The Garfield County Sheriff's Office notified the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. A search was organized. The roads in and out of Glenwood Springs were examined. The surrounding area was checked in the ways that made sense for a man on foot in deep winter. None of it found him. He was not on foot in the mountains. He was not hiding in the canyon. He was already moving across the high plateau of central Colorado, traveling south and east in the January dark, toward a country that did not yet know he was free. Back in the jail, the cell stood empty. The cot was made in the flat mechanical way of a man who had slept in institutions long enough that the habit was automatic. The legal papers were still there. The files and case notes he had used as cover for his nighttime wakefulness, the materials of his own defence, sat on the small shelf where he had kept them. A coffee cup, or something like it, still held its place. The cell looked less abandoned than simply vacated, as if the occupant had stepped out for a moment and would return. He would not return. Outside the jail, Glenwood Springs woke to its ordinary first morning of the last day of the year. The canyon ridgelines were white. The Colorado River ran dark and cold below its bridges. Businesses opened their doors in the careful way of mountain towns in winter, letting out the warm interior air in brief clouds of steam, before the doors closed again against the cold. Somewhere in the distance south of town, the roads ran straight and empty through the high desert toward the rest of America. He was already on them. The discovery of his escape, when it reached the wider world through news services and wire reports over the following days, produced a particular kind of institutional shock. He had escaped before. They had increased their precautions. And he had escaped again, more carefully, more deliberately, from a building that should have held him, using nothing but time and patience and a willingness to make himself smaller. The mechanics of it were almost insulting in their simplicity. He had not had help. He had not had tools in any meaningful sense. He had worked at a ceiling fixture with his hands over a period of weeks and then crawled through the dark above a sleeping building and walked out into the cold. The new year came to Glenwood Springs without him. The hot springs pools steamed in the January air. The canyon walls caught what pale light the winter sun offered and held it briefly before the shadows closed in again. The Garfield County Jail processed its ordinary population of men waiting on hearings, men serving short time, men with small troubles and bounded futures. The cell that had held Theodore Bundy sat empty and cold. The ceiling above it had been patched. It would not happen again, not here, but the man was gone, and where he was going no patch in any ceiling was going to be relevant for very much longer. Chapter 3. The first time he ran. To understand December, you have to go back to June. The first escape did not begin in the cell at night. It began on a Tuesday morning in a courthouse in Aspen, Colorado, in the clean mountain summer light, in a law library on the second floor of the Pitkin County Courthouse, where Theodore Bundy had been brought from the Garfield County Jail for a hearing related to the murder of Karen Campbell. It was June 7th, 1977. The aspens outside the courthouse windows were in full summer leaf. The town of Aspen, in those years not yet entirely transformed into the resort destination it would become, was quiet in its commercial sections and busy in its outdoor areas, the trails and river paths that made it attractive to the kind of people who came to Colorado in summer to move through the landscape rather than to gamble on it. Bundy had been representing himself in part throughout his Colorado proceedings. This gave him reasons to be in the law library. He'd been escorted there with what his security detail considered sufficient oversight, but what they were providing was not the kind of close physical custody that would have been appropriate for a man who had already demonstrated a willingness to study his environment and look for exits. The law library occupied a room on the second floor of the courthouse. Its windows overlooked a side section of the building. The drop to the ground was approximately 20 feet. Bundy had examined the window during earlier visits to the library. He had formed his assessment of it. While his escort was elsewhere in the library, he opened the window and jumped. The drop was significant. He landed hard enough to injure his ankle, though the extent of the injury and how much it hampered him in the days that followed has been characterized differently in different accounts. He ran from the alley below the window and into the streets of Aspen, moving as quickly as his landing had left him able to move. He was in street clothes. He had no obvious markers of custody. Aspen in summer held enough visitors and outdoor enthusiasts that a man moving through it on foot did not immediately announce himself as an escaped prisoner. He had a small amount of time before the alarm was raised. He used it to put distance between himself and the courthouse. The Pitkin County authorities raised the alarm quickly. Aspen was searched. The roads in and out were watched. But Aspen sits at the base of mountains that extend for miles in multiple directions, and the mountains in summer offer cover of a different kind than the mountains in winter. There is vegetation, terrain, shelter in the form of old cabins and Forest Service structures, and enough wilderness that a man who chooses to go into it becomes very difficult to find without a significant organized search. Bundy went into the mountains above Aspen. The 6 days he spent there between June 7th and June 13th were not comfortable. His ankle was troubling him. He was not equipped for sustained wilderness survival. He had no reliable food source. He broke into at least one cabin in the mountains, possibly more, taking food and whatever else was useful. He slept in whatever shelter he could find. The mountain nights in June at altitude are cold, not as brutal as December, but cold enough to be serious without adequate clothing and bedding. He was moving through high terrain on a bad ankle, eating whatever he had managed to take from cabins, trying to work out a plan that would get him away from Colorado entirely. He had no plan that worked. The mountains that seemed like cover were also a trap. The roads out of the Aspen area were being watched. He could not simply walk down from the mountains and buy a bus ticket. He needed a vehicle, and finding and using a vehicle without resources and without contacts in an area where his face was circulating in law enforcement bulletins was more difficult than it had seemed from inside a cell. On June 13th, 6 days after his escape, Aspen police officers stopped a car that was being driven erratically through the streets of the town in the early morning hours. The driver was thin, pale, not dressed well for someone driving a car in a mountain town at that hour, not entirely coherent in the way that suggested exhaustion and cold and several days without adequate food. It was Bundy. He had made it 6 days. He had managed to get back down from the mountains and into the town. He had found or stolen a car, but the driving gave him away. The erratic movement of the vehicle attracted exactly the attention he needed most to avoid. The officers who pulled him over recognized him or quickly established his identity. He was taken back into custody. The recapture produced immediate decisions about where to hold him. The Pitkin County facility in Aspen was judged to be inadequately secure for a man who had demonstrated his willingness to use any available opportunity. The Garfield County Jail in Glenwood Springs was the answer. He would be transferred there and kept under conditions that were intended to prevent a second escape. The courthouse window trick would not work there. He would be in a cell, watched more carefully, held until his trial. What the transfer did not account for was time. Bundy was transferred to Glenwood Springs in the summer, and his trial was not imminent. There were months ahead of him. Months of being in a cell with a ceiling. Months of listening to a building's rhythms. Months of eating less than he was given and paying attention to the structural logic of the space he occupied. What the increased security could not eliminate was the time itself, and what a patient and methodical person could do with that time. The courthouse escape had been impulsive in comparison with what would come later. He had seen an opportunity and taken it without detailed preparation, and the result had been 6 miserable days in the mountains, followed by recapture in a stolen car in the early morning. It was not a success, but it was not without its lessons. He had learned that improvisation without preparation led to cold mountains and an injured ankle and 6 days of diminishing options. He had learned that the American wilderness, however vast, was not actually a route to freedom for a man without resources and without outside help. He had learned that the way out was not through the mountains. It was south, through the flat and populated interior, through cities and bus stations and the anonymous movement of people in transit who do not examine one another's faces. He had also learned, more practically, that security arrangements focused on the obvious exits and not always on the structural fabric of the building itself. A courthouse window had been an obvious exit, and his use of it had cost him 6 days, and his freedom. The ceiling of a cell was not an obvious exit. Neither was a crawl space above a sleeping jailer's apartment. The lesson of June was that you prepared for the thing that was not obvious, that you worked toward it slowly and carefully and without announcing your direction, and that when you finally moved, you moved with a destination in mind beyond the immediate next step. He spent the summer and the fall in Glenwood Springs applying that lesson. The transfer to the Garfield County Jail had been intended as a solution. In the end, it was simply a different problem, and Bundy was willing to take all the time he needed to solve it. The first escape had been a test of his instincts. The second would be a demonstration of his patience. Outside the Pitkin County Courthouse in Aspen, the summer of 1977 continued without him. The Aspens caught the afternoon light in the way they do at altitude, bright and trembling on their white trunks. The kind of light that makes the mountain air look as though it has a temperature and a texture. Hikers moved through the trails above the town. The river ran clear and quick through its channel. The town had its summer life of tourists and outdoor people, and the particular cheerful busyness of a mountain resort in its good season. None of that concerned him anymore. He was in Glenwood Springs in a cell, looking at a ceiling, beginning to think about December. Expert. Chapter 4. The Long Road South. Chwat. The last day of 1977 passed largely without him noticing it in any meaningful sense. He was moving. That was the only thing that mattered. South and east, away from the canyon and the jail and the cold that had been his world for the better part of a year. The American interior opened around him as he travelled. The high plateau country of western Colorado, the wide, cold plains of the eastern part of the state, the long roads through the ranch country where the distances between settlements are measured in the kind of miles that make you feel the planet's size. He was not driving comfortably or easily. He had no money to speak of, no warm clothes adequate to the weather, no documents that would hold up to scrutiny, and a face that had been circulating in law enforcement bulletins since the previous summer. He was also, by any reasonable measure, exhausted. The weeks of preparation in the cell, the night crawl through the ceiling, the first brutal hours in the open winter air of Glenwood Springs, the improvised movement through a town that would very shortly know he was gone, none of it had been restful. He was running on the specific fuel of a person who has wanted a thing intensely for a very long time and has finally moved toward it. A fuel that burns bright and then burns low, and he needed to be far away before it burned low. He headed for Chicago. Why Chicago as a first destination reflects a logic of distance and anonymity rather than any specific connection to the city. Chicago was large. Chicago was far from Colorado. Chicago had bus terminals and train stations and the kind of dense urban movement in which a single unfamiliar face dissolves immediately into the background of all the other unfamiliar faces passing through. He had been in the news in Colorado, but the news in Colorado in late 1977 did not travel instantaneously to every corner of the country in the way it would decades later. A man arriving in Chicago without identification and without money was not automatically a man anyone was looking for. He was, at first glance, just another person passing through. The journey from Colorado to Chicago took several days. The exact mechanics of how he travelled through those early days, which roads, which towns, which particular combination of stolen vehicles and hitchhiking and bus travel have been pieced together from later investigation, but are not complete in every detail. What is clear is that he moved continuously, sleeping when he could in whatever shelter was available, eating in the minimal and opportunistic way of someone with no reliable resources, always heading east and then northeast. The Colorado winter landscape gave way to the Kansas plains, flat and frozen and enormous in the winter light. The sky above Kansas in January is a particular kind of sky, pale at the horizon, deeper blue overhead, and so wide that the land beneath it feels pressed down by the sheer extent of it. The roads ran straight for distances that had no equivalent in the mountain country he had left. There was nothing to interrupt the view. There was nothing to hide behind. The only cover was forward movement and the indifference of a landscape that did not distinguish between one traveller and another. He ate when he could. Gas station food, the kind of cheap and caloric provisions available to a person with very little money at the kind of small highway stops that existed then along the interstate routes. Packaged crackers, vending machine items, coffee when there was a machine and when he had coins. He was not eating well. He had not eaten well for months. His frame, already deliberately thinned through the fall, was being further reduced by the demands of sustained travel and the cold and the stress that he was managing through will rather than through any available physical comfort. He reached Chicago sometime in the first days of January 1978. The city in January was its own kind of cold, different from the Colorado cold. The mountain cold was dry and thin and quiet, a cold that came from altitude and from the absence of warmth rather than from the active presence of a wind carrying moisture off a lake. The Chicago cold was physical and constant and came at you from multiple directions. The wind off Lake Michigan in early January moved through streets between tall buildings and found every inadequacy in a person's clothing and addressed them directly. He was in the city for a brief period, making use of what it offered. Warmth in public buildings, the cover of crowds, the impersonal functioning of a large urban transit system. He used the Greyhound bus terminal, which in those years was the kind of place where a person without obvious resources was not notably out of place, where people waited for long stretches on uncomfortable benches and bought food from a counter, and looked at departure boards without anyone taking particular interest in them. The bus terminal was, for his purposes, functional. He could be no one there. From Chicago he continued moving. The accounts of his journey place him briefly in Michigan, in the Ann Arbor area, before he turned south. Why he went to Michigan is not entirely clear from the record. Ann Arbor was a university town. It had a certain kind of population, students and academic transients, that made newcomers unremarkable. He may have had a specific reason for going there. He may have been simply continuing the logic of distance and anonymity, moving through cities that offered the most cover before committing to a final destination. He turned south. The route south from Michigan through Ohio and Kentucky and Tennessee and into the deep south follows the logic of the American interstate system, efficient, impersonal, populated by the continuous movement of trucks and travelers who pay very little attention to one another. He was on buses for much of this leg of the journey. A bus in 1978 was a particular social world. The passengers were not, for the most part, people with many other options. They were people travelling long distances without the means to do it any other way, people moving between cities for reasons that were usually economic or familial, people who were tired and not interested in conversation, and who looked at the seat back in front of them or out the window at the country passing by. He sat among them and was simply another body in a seat. He was moving toward Florida. Florida had specific advantages that he had apparently identified before he left Colorado. It was warm, in the practical sense that mattered to a man who had been cold for months and who was not dressed for winter. It had a large population of transients, people who came from elsewhere and stayed temporarily and then moved on, which made newcomers less conspicuous than they would have been in smaller or more insular communities. It had universities which had around them the particular social texture of places where young people came from, many different backgrounds, and no one was necessarily known to anyone else. And it was far from Colorado geographically and in terms of law enforcement jurisdiction. He arrived in Tallahassee, Florida, around January 8, 1978. He had been traveling for approximately 9 days since leaving the Garfield County Jail. He had covered roughly 2,000 miles through the American winter using a combination of whatever transportation was available to a man without money or documents. He was thin and tired, and the clothes he had been wearing since December 30th were not adequate to much of anything. But he was warm now. Or warmer in the way that Florida in January is warm relative to a jail cell in a Colorado canyon. Tallahassee in January was not the hottest, almost festive version of itself. The Florida Panhandle where Tallahassee sits is not the tropical Florida of the postcards. It has cold snaps in January, genuine cold, though nothing approaching what he had left behind. The live oaks along the streets kept their leaves through the winter, dark and glossy and slightly Spanish-looking with their hanging moss. The state capitol building sat on its hill in the center of town. The campus of Florida State University spread south of downtown, its brick buildings set among those same live oaks, its dormitories and Greek houses populated by students who had returned from their Christmas break and were settling back into the rhythms of the spring semester. He found a room. The rooming house where he settled, a property on West College Avenue run by a person named Chris Hagen, was close enough to the university campus to be within its social orbit without being part of the institution itself. He gave a name that was not his own. He paid for the room with money he had acquired along the way by means that were not always legal. He moved into the room and he began to be a person with an address and a daily routine. He went out in the evenings. He spent time in the bars and restaurants near the university. He was not obviously out of place. He was a young man, reasonably well-spoken, with a manner that had always allowed him to pass without attracting particular attention in ordinary social settings. He ate. He slept. He did the things that a person does in a rented room. He slept in the bed, used the shared bathroom, heard the sounds of the other tenants through the walls, learned the sounds of the house's particular personality, the pipes, the floorboards, the pattern of the street outside, at different hours. On the surface, he was simply a man who had rented a room near a university campus. He had been in Tallahassee for just over a week when the spring semester classes began in earnest at Florida State. The sorority houses along Sorority Row were fully occupied again. The lights in them burned late into the evenings. The sounds of student life moved through the neighborhood. Music, conversation, the rhythm of communal living among young people who had every reason to feel safe in their campus world, who were at the beginning of their adult lives and could not have imagined in any version of their thinking what was moving through the streets of their city and watching the lights in their windows. His room was quiet. The West College Avenue house settled into its nighttime sounds. The street outside went dark and still. January 15th was still 1 week away. Chapter 5. West College Avenue. Tum. The room he rented was small and ordinary in the way that rented rooms near universities have always been ordinary. A bed, a window, A shared bathroom down the hall, walls that held the faint record of every previous tenant in their scuffs and nail holes, and the particular layered smell of many different people's lives passing through the same enclosed space. The house at 409 West College Avenue was a rooming house, the kind of building that exists in every American college town. Slightly worn, slightly underfunded, its rooms let to people who needed somewhere to stay for reasons that were not always discussed with the landlord. He registered as Chris Hagen. It was not an elaborate alias. He did not construct a detailed false history around it, or produce documents that would have held up to serious scrutiny. He gave the name, paid what he owed, and moved into the room. The name was enough for the purpose. No one at the rooming house had reason to look further than the name and the payment. He was a young man who needed a room near a university campus. There were always young men who needed rooms near university campuses. He was not remarkable. Tallahassee in the second week of January was cool and damp. The particular Florida winter that surprised people who came from elsewhere, expecting warmth and found instead a pale, quiet cold that came off the Gulf and settled into the lowland streets, and sat in the live oak moss and made the mornings grey and still. It was not Colorado cold. It was nothing like Colorado cold. After the canyon and the crawl space and the 9 days of travelling through the American winter, the Tallahassee January felt almost mild. The way a room that has been only slightly heated feels warm to someone who has come in from genuine frost. He slept. In the first days in the room on West College Avenue, he slept more than he had slept in months. The cot in the Garfield County Jail had not been a place of rest in any real sense. A bed you are not free to leave is not the same thing as a bed you have chosen. He lay in the rented room on West College Avenue and slept in the way of someone whose body has been borrowing against a debt it now had the chance to begin repaying. He ate too. The food near the Florida State campus in January 1978 was the food of the neighborhood's economics. Cheap breakfast places where the eggs came fast and the coffee came in thick ceramic mugs, sandwich counters, pizza by the slice, the kind of modest American food that costs very little and provides the specific satisfaction of someone who has been eating inadequately for weeks. He had money enough for these things, but quite along the way through means that were not always clean, and he spent some of it on food and some on the ordinary provisions a person needs when setting up a temporary life in a rented room. He moved through the neighborhood in the days that followed his arrival with the practiced unremarkability of someone who understood that the best disguise was simply behaving like someone who belonged where he was. The Florida State campus was exactly the kind of environment where that was possible. It was a large state university with a student body in the tens of thousands, and the neighborhood around it had the social texture of all such places, young people moving between classes and housing, and the local bars and restaurants and shops, transient in their individual presences but collectively always present, so that the face of any particular person was unlikely to be fixed in anyone else's memory for long. He walked the streets around the campus in the evenings. He went into the bars where students gathered, the kinds of places that existed on and around every American college campus in the 1970s, low-lit, noisy enough to make conversation selective, cheap beer in pitchers on wooden tables, the particular social atmosphere of places where young people are working out who they are and what they want and testing both against the company they keep. He sat at bars and drank moderately and watched. Sorority Row lay not far from where he was living. It ran along a section of West Jefferson Street, the houses set back from the street behind their Greek letters and their institutional landscaping, large and well maintained by the standards of student housing, lit in the evenings with the warm light of communal living. The Chi Omega House was among them. It was one of the largest sororities at Florida State, housed in a substantial two-story building, its rooms occupied by more than 30 women during the spring semester. In January they had returned from their Christmas break and settled back into the routines of the semester. Classes, study sessions, house meetings, the shared meals and shared bathrooms and shared domestic life of sorority living. The Chi Omega House had no security in any formal sense. It did not need to have considered such a thing. The doors were locked at night in the ordinary way of residential buildings, but the locks were the locks of a house that expected its residents to come and go at irregular hours. And the building's nature as a communal home for young women at a university campus in 1978 did not prompt its administration or its members to think in terms of who might come in from outside. The house was their home. It was a safe place on a campus in a college town in Florida. There was no framework available to them in which it would have seemed otherwise. He walked past it on several occasions during the days before January 15th. He walked the route between Sorority Row and West College Avenue in both directions. He noted the distances and the layout and the way the neighborhood fell quiet at different hours of the night. He was doing what he had done in the jail, learning the building's rhythms and the rhythms of the spaces around it, mapping what he could not control against what he could anticipate. In the room on West College Avenue, the days passed with a quietness that was deceptive. He was not idle. He was not resting in any meaningful sense after the first few days of sleep and food. He was present in the neighborhood, present on the campus periphery, present in the bars and on the streets, watching and moving and waiting. From the outside, from the perspective of the landlord who collected his rent, and the bar staff who served him, and the students who sat near him without taking particular notice, he was simply a man passing through Tallahassee on his way to whatever came next. He had no legitimate source of income. The money he had arrived with was running down. He had taken some things from residences along the way south, small theft that went unreported or were reported without connection to anything else. He was not living comfortably. The room was cheap, but it was not free, and the ordinary costs of a life, food and transportation, and the minimum requirements of keeping himself presentable enough to pass unnoticed, ate through what he had. He stole a bicycle at some point during his time in Tallahassee, which gave him quieter mobility around the neighborhood than walking allowed. He used it at night. The Florida State campus at night in January had its own atmosphere. The academic buildings were closed and dark. The residential areas, the dormitories and the sorority and fraternity houses maintained their warm internal light into the late hours. The live oaks along the streets stood still and heavy in the dark, their moss hanging without movement on still nights. The Spanish moss that is both the charm and the slight unease of those streets, the thing that makes them beautiful in daylight and slightly oppressive after midnight. The street lamps cast their ordinary circles of light. Between them, the streets were dark in the way that streets in residential neighborhoods are dark when the hour is late and the traffic has stopped, and the only sounds are the very occasional car and the insects that even in January maintain some low version of their presence in the Florida night air. He moved through those streets at night more than once before January 15th. He was establishing geography and timing. He was satisfying himself about certain things: the route from his room to the sorority house, the time it took to cover the distance on foot, the behavior of the neighborhood at different hours past midnight, what was visible and what was not visible, what sounds the night held and which ones belonged to it permanently and which would stand out. He had been in Tallahassee for approximately 8 days when January 15th arrived. The day itself passed in whatever ordinary way, days in a rented room near a university campus pass. He would have eaten, as he usually did, cheaply and without ceremony. He may have spent time in the neighborhood during the daylight hours, or he may have stayed close to the room. He was not enrolled in any class. He had no job to report to. He had nowhere he was required to be. The day passed around him as the day passes for a person with no structure and no obligation except the internal logic of what they have decided to do. In the Chi Omega house, January 15th was an ordinary Sunday. The women in the house went to and from the campus, to the library, to meals, to the social events that marked the early weeks of the spring semester. A party had been held at a local establishment called Sherrod's that evening, and a number of Chi Omega members had attended. They came home at different hours through the evening and the early part of the night, as young people in college houses do, the house absorbing their return in the ordinary way of communal living. Doors opening and closing, voices in the corridors, the particular domestic sound of a large household gradually settling towards sleep. By 2:30 in the morning, most of the house was quiet. The room on West College Avenue was dark. The street outside was still. Somewhere in the neighborhood, a bicycle sat where it had been left. The night had its usual sounds. The live oak moss hung without movement. The Florida January air had its specific temperature and its specific smell of damp soil and old vegetation and the distant suggestion of the Gulf. The street lamps held their circles. Between them, the dark held its own. He was already moving. Chapter 6. The night of January 15th. What happened inside the Chi Omega house at Florida State University between approximately 3 and 3:30 in the morning on January 15th, 1978 is established through physical evidence, through the testimony of the women who survived, and through the forensic examination that followed. It is established in the clinical and precise language of law and medicine. That precision does not diminish what it records. It makes it heavier. The doors of the Chi Omega house were locked in the ordinary way. He entered through a back door. Exactly how it was opened without noise sufficient to alert anyone has been examined in detail across the years. The door had a lock of the kind common in residential buildings of that era, not a deadbolt, not a mechanism that required a key to open from the inside if it had been left in a particular position. He was inside without breaking anything in a way that would have made sound. He was in a house of sleeping women, and he had made no announcement of his arrival. He went upstairs. The house at that hour was dark in its common areas and dark in its corridor. The bedroom doors were closed. The sounds of the building were the sounds of deep night, the particular stillness of a house full of people asleep, the climate system running at its low setting, the occasional shift of a body in a bed registering as the faintest creak of springs, the ambient sound of a building that is at rest. He had a log taken from outside the building. It was not a weapon he had brought with him. It was something he had found and picked up, a piece of oak or similar wood, roughly the diameter of a man's forearm. The kind of thing that lies around the exterior of a landscaped property without anyone noting its presence. He went to Margaret Bowman's room first. Margaret Bowman was 21 years old. She was from St. Petersburg, Florida. She was a junior at Florida State, studying communications. She had been at charades earlier that evening with other members of the sorority, and had come home and gone to bed in the ordinary way of a Sunday night before a Monday of classes. Her door was closed. The corridor outside it was dark and quiet. She was asleep. He entered her room. The medical examiner's findings in the case of Margaret Bowman established that she died of strangulation, a nylon stocking having been used as a ligature. The blunt force injuries to her head were also severe. She did not survive and she did not recover consciousness. She died in her room in the dark, in her own bed, in a house she had every reason to believe was safe. She was the first. He moved through the corridor to another room. Lisa Levy was 20 years old. She was from St. Petersburg as well, though she and Margaret Bowman had not grown up as close friends. She was a member of Chi Omega and was known to the other women in the house as warm and socially active, someone who moved easily through the communal life of the sorority. She had been at the same gathering that evening. She was asleep. What was done to Lisa Levy before she died included a bite, inflicted with enough force to leave a clear impression in the tissue of her left buttock. This detail would become central to the case against Bundy. At the time, in the dark of her room, it was simply part of what he did before he killed her. She died of a combination of strangulation and blunt force injuries. She was 20 years old. She died in her room on a Sunday night at the beginning of a semester she had come back from Christmas to complete. He was not yet finished inside the house. He went to another room. Karen Chandler was in her bed. He struck her with the log. She sustained a broken jaw, a broken finger, a fractured skull, and the loss of several teeth. She survived, though her injuries were serious enough to require significant medical attention and recovery. She did not wake fully during the attack, or as she did, her state of consciousness in the immediate aftermath was impaired enough that her later testimony concerned what she experienced rather than what she saw. He went to the room shared by Kathy Kleiner and a roommate. Kathy Kleiner was struck as well. Her jaw was broken. Her shoulder was injured. She survived. She woke partially during or after the attack in a state of profound pain and confusion, bleeding into her bedding, not yet understanding what had happened, or that the man who had done it was no longer in the room. The 4 rooms. 4 women. A period of time that investigators later estimated at between 15 and 30 minutes for the entire sequence inside the house. He had entered through the back door and moved through the building and committed acts that killed 2 people and gravely injured 2 more, and then he left through the front door. He was seen leaving. Nita Neary was a Chi Omega member who was returning to the house from a date in the early morning hours. She came through the front door at approximately 3 in the morning. In the light of the entrance area, she saw a figure moving quickly toward that same front door from the interior of the house. He was wearing a dark cap pulled low. He was carrying something, a log or stick of some kind, down along his leg. He pushed past the front door and was gone before she had fully processed what she had seen. She stood in the entrance hallway for a moment. The house was quiet around her. Whatever she had seen, it had been fast and strange, and she was not certain what it meant. She went upstairs. She found what was in the corridor and in the rooms, and the night became something that did not end for a long time. The sounds that followed, the voices, the calls for help, the arrival of other residents waking to what they were hearing, The emergency calls that went out to the Tallahassee Police Department and to Leon County authorities. All of those sounds came quickly and all at once, and they ended the deep quiet that the house had held for the hours before them. The house filled with the particular horrible activity of a place that has become a crime scene, and a place of grief at the same time. Police and ambulances and the women who lived in the building, standing in the corridors in various states of waking, barefoot on the carpet in the early morning cold, not yet able to hold all of what they were being told. Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy were beyond help by the time the paramedics arrived. Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner were taken to the hospital. They would survive. The investigation began in the same hours. Tallahassee Police Detective Don Patchen and others worked through the night and the early morning in the Chi Omega house, documenting what the rooms held, cataloguing the physical evidence, beginning the work of understanding what had happened and who had done it. The bite mark on Lisa Levy's body was noted and photographed. The forensic significance of that detail was understood. A bite mark of that clarity and depth was a potential point of identification. Dental evidence of a kind that had been used in criminal cases and that could, if a suspect was identified, be compared against that suspect's dentition. There was no suspect yet. The evidence of entry and exit was examined. The back door showed no damage consistent with forced entry, suggesting it had been opened without breaking it. The log, or what remained of it in terms of physical traces, was documented. Nita Neary's account of the figure she had seen at the front door was taken down. The dark cap, the side profile, the object carried low, these became part of the record. The house on Sorority Row stood in the pale light of the January morning with its police tape and its emergency vehicles, and its cluster of stunned residents gathered at a distance, in the way that people gather when the thing that has happened is too large to approach directly. The live oaks along the street held their moss in the still air. The sky was the grey of a Florida winter morning, flat and cool and without particular colour. Inside the house, in rooms that had been ordinary rooms 14 hours earlier, the investigators moved carefully through the evidence of what had passed there. The beds held the evidence of what had been done in them. The walls held what walls hold when violence has moved through a space. The corridor between the rooms held the path that had connected them. 2 women were dead. 2 others were in the hospital. The semester had been underway for less than 2 weeks. He was already blocks away. Trupp. Chapter 7. Dunwoody Street, Trupp. He had not gone back to West College Avenue after leaving the Chi Omega house. He moved through the streets of the sleeping neighborhood in the direction that took him south and east of Sorority Row, away from the house and away from whatever he knew or suspected would be coming once the house woke to what he had left in it. The January night was still around him. The live oak streets were dark between their street lamps. He was on foot, moving quickly, carrying nothing that would identify him and nothing that he had taken from inside the house. He was not running. Running in a residential street at 3 in the morning is a sound and emotion that registers. He moved at the pace of someone who is going somewhere specific, at an unusual hour, not panicked, not looking over his shoulder, just moving. Dunwoody Street lay approximately 8 blocks from the Chi Omega house. It was a street of small apartments and houses in the residential grid south of the campus, the kind of neighborhood that housed graduate students and young faculty and the working residents of a college town who were not students themselves but lived in the affordable housing that a university generates around it. The apartments were modest. The street was quiet. It had none of the institutional character of Sorority Row, and none of the concentrated collegiate energy of the buildings closer to the center of campus. It was simply a residential street in Tallahassee in the early hours of a Monday morning in January. Its windows dark, its parked cars frosted slightly in the night air, its sidewalks empty. Cheryl Thomas lived at 431 Dunwoody Street. She was 21 years old. She was a dancer, a student in the dance program at Florida State University, and the physical demands of that discipline had shaped the specific rhythms of her daily life. The early hours in the studio, the particular attention to the body that serious dance training required, the social world of a small and dedicated program within a large university. She was not a member of Chi Omega. She did not know the women in the house on Sorority Row except perhaps by the ordinary peripheral awareness that students develop of one another across a campus. She had no connection to what had happened there that night. She was asleep in her apartment. He had been in the neighborhood before. Whether he had identified Cheryl Thomas's apartment specifically in advance, or whether his presence on Dunwoody Street that night was a function of continued movement through the area, rather than a specific prior targeting of this address, is not entirely clear from the evidence. What the evidence establishes is that he entered her apartment that night. The apartment, like the Chi Omega house, was not broken into in the sense of a forced entry that destroyed a lock or a door frame. It was entered through a means that left the physical structure of the door largely intact, which suggested a lock that was imperfect or a point of entry that had been identified. She woke during the attack. This is one of the details that distinguishes the Dunwoody Street assault from what had happened at the Chi Omega house. She regained consciousness while the attack was in progress. She fought. The struggle left physical evidence in the apartment and on her body that would be significant in the investigation. She was struck. The blows caused a fracture to her skull. She sustained damage to the nerves that connect to her left ear that resulted in permanent hearing loss, and a vestibular injury that destroyed her sense of balance in ways that could never be fully repaired. She had been training as a dancer. The vestibular system, the inner ear mechanism that governs balance and spatial orientation, is foundational to a dancer's ability to function. Its destruction was not a peripheral injury. It ended the career she had been building at the university, the physical practice that had defined much of her young life. She survived the assault, but what she survived it as, in terms of her body's capabilities, was different from what she had been the night before. A neighbor heard sounds through the wall that were not the sounds of ordinary apartment life at that hour. She heard rhythmic sounds, a thumping or knocking against the shared wall between the apartments, that suggested distress without announcing it clearly. She called the police. This call brought officers to Dunwoody Street while the night was still dark, while the Chi Omega house had not yet fully processed what had happened inside it, and while the Tallahassee Police Department was not yet aware that two separate attack sites existed less than a mile from one another. The officers who arrived at 431 Dunwoody Street found Cheryl Thomas unconscious on the floor of her apartment. She was alive. The apartment showed the evidence of what had taken place, the physical disorder of a space in which a struggle had occurred, the blood evidence, the condition of the door and the window points of entry, and on the floor of the apartment, investigators found an item that became a significant piece of physical evidence in the case that would eventually be built against Bundy. A pantyhose mask, a crude disguise fashioned from a stocking, of the kind that someone might pull over their face to obscure their features. It had been discarded or lost in the struggle or in the exit from the apartment. The pantyhose mask connected Dunwoody Street to the Chi Omega house in ways that became clearer as the investigation developed. The nature of the attacks, the method of entry, the timing, the proximity of the two locations, the manner in which the violence had been conducted. Investigators working both scenes in the hours after the discovery recognized that they were almost certainly dealing with a single person who had moved from one location to the other in the same night, on foot, through the quiet streets of the residential neighborhood south of the Florida State campus. Cheryl Thomas was taken to the hospital. She would survive. She would recover in the partial and permanent way that people recover from injuries that have altered something in the body that cannot be unaltered. She would regain much of her function and would go on to live her life. But the dance career was gone. The inner ear that had helped her move through space with the precision that serious dance demands had been damaged past repair. This fact, set beside the fact of two deaths half a mile away, is one of the ways in which the night of January 15th measured its cost. Not only in the immediate and visible, but in the quiet and permanent, in the life that continued differently. The investigators working the Dunwoody Street scene collected the pantyhose mask and the other physical evidence from the apartment. They photographed the room in the flat, an exhaustive way of forensic documentation. They noted the points of entry and the signs of struggle. They began the process of connecting what they were looking at to what their colleagues were simultaneously documenting at the Chi Omega house. As the morning progressed and the scale of the night became clearer, the Leon County Sheriff's Department and the Tallahassee Police Department began coordinating on what was now clearly a major criminal investigation. 2 women dead in a sorority house. 2 others hospitalized with serious injuries from the same building. 1 more woman critically injured in an apartment nearby. All in the same window of time on a Sunday night in January, all within walking distance of one another. The Florida State campus woke to this news slowly through the Monday morning. Word moved through dormitories and Greek houses and classroom buildings in the incremental, imprecise and collectively frightening way that serious crime news moves through a contained community. No one yet had a suspect. No one yet had a name. The investigation was hours old. The physical evidence was being processed. The witnesses, those who had anything to offer, were giving their accounts to investigators who were simultaneously managing several active scenes and a growing administrative response from the university and from law enforcement at the county and state levels. Cheryl Thomas lay in the hospital, unconscious for a period and then conscious in the confused and painful way of someone emerging from a serious head injury, not yet aware of the full extent of what had been taken from her or of the larger catastrophe in which her assault had been a second movement. On West College Avenue, the room rented to Chris Hargan sat quiet in the Monday morning. The bed had been slept in or not. The papers and whatever ordinary objects a man keeps in a rented room were in their places. The street outside had its morning traffic, students going to early classes, the slow resumption of a campus day. The house itself was not yet connected to anything. The name Chris Hargan meant nothing to anyone. The room was simply a rented room in a college town, holding the minimal traces of the person who had paid for it and used it, and who was, somewhere in the city or beyond it, still moving. The live oaks along Dunwoody Street held their morning shadow. The apartment at number 431 was sealed behind police tape. The pantyhose mask was in an evidence bag. The neighbour who had made the call that brought officers to the scene had given her account and been left with the particular terrible burden of wondering whether she had called soon enough, whether an earlier call would have changed what she found when the door was opened. There is no answer to that question that improves anything. Somewhere in Tallahassee, the morning went about its business. The campus continued. The investigation deepened. The name of the person responsible for the night of January 15th was not yet on any investigator's list in Florida, though it was on a great many lists in Colorado, where the Garfield County Sheriff's Office had been looking for an escaped prisoner since the morning of December 31st, and where the connection to what had just happened at Florida State University was not yet visible to anyone. The distance between Glenwood Springs and Tallahassee is roughly 2,000 miles. The distance in the investigation would close very slowly over the weeks ahead, and by the time it closed, the night of January 15th would have been followed by something else entirely. Something that happened on a February morning in a city called Lake City, 100 miles east of Tallahassee, and that concerned a child. But that was still 3 weeks away. For now, the evidence sat in its bags and its files and its photographs. The hospital held its patients. The Chi Omega house stood behind its tape in the pale January light, and the investigation, enormous and still largely formless, began to do the patient work of moving from evidence toward name. Chapter 8. What the house held. The light that came up over Tallahassee on the morning of January 16th was the flat, pale light of a Florida winter, the kind of morning that offers illumination without warmth, that makes the wet grass and the dark bark of the live oaks look very precise and very still. By the time that light was strong enough to define the shapes of the buildings along Sorority Row, the Chi Omega house had been a crime scene for several hours. The police tape was already up. The vehicles of the Leon County Sheriff's Department and the Tallahassee Police Department were already parked along the street. Officers and investigators had already been moving through the interior of the buildings since before 4 in the morning, and the work of documenting what had happened inside it was well advanced. The house itself still looked like itself from the outside. That is one of the difficult facts about buildings in which violence has occurred. The exterior holds. The roofline is the same. The windows are the same. The door at the front is the same door it was yesterday. Nothing in the architecture announces that the interior has been changed by what passed through us in the night. Only the police tape and the official vehicles and the particular stillness of a building that is being professionally examined rather than ordinarily inhabited tell the observer that something has altered permanently in the space behind those walls. Inside, the work was methodical and slow. Forensic documentation in 1978 was not the discipline it would become in later decades. The tools were different. The databases were different. The capacity to cross-reference physical evidence across jurisdictions and across time was limited in ways that would seem extraordinary later. But the foundational work was the same. Photograph everything, collect everything. Disturb nothing that has not yet been recorded. Build a physical record of the scene that can survive the distance between the event and the courtroom. The investigators who worked the Chi Omega house in those early morning hours knew how to do that work, and they did it carefully. The rooms in which Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy had died were processed with particular care. The physical evidence in each room was photographed and collected. The ligature marks on Margaret Bowman's neck were documented by the medical examiner. The injuries to Lisa Levy were documented in full, including the bite mark on her left buttock, which was photographed with the specific attention that investigators with any experience in forensic odontology understood it deserved. A bite mark of that clarity and depth, inflicted with the force evident in the tissue, was not a common piece of evidence, and its value in any subsequent identification depended entirely on the quality of its documentation at the scene. Dr. Richard Sueron, a forensic odontologist, would later be involved in the examination of that evidence. In the hours immediately after the discovery of the bodies, the investigators on the scene were not yet thinking about a specific courtroom and a specific defense. They were thinking about the room in front of them and what it held and what needed to be preserved. The bite mark was preserved. The photographs were taken. The evidence was properly collected and logged. In the rooms where Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner had been attacked, the evidence told a different story, a story of survival rather than death, but no less demanding in its forensic requirements. The blood evidence, the physical disarray of the rooms, the condition of the bedding, the injuries documented by the paramedics who had responded to the scene, all of it was recorded. The log, or the traces of what the log had left behind, was documented. The path through the building, from the back entry point through the corridors and into the rooms, was examined for whatever it could offer, in terms of footwear impressions, fingerprints, or trace material. The back door through which he had entered was examined closely. It had not been forced in a way that left obvious damage to the frame or the lock housing. The mechanism of entry was not immediately apparent, which itself told investigators something. This was not a random opportunistic entry by someone who had kicked in a door or broken a window. Someone had opened the door. The question of how was one of many questions the investigation was carrying forward into the morning. The women who lived in the house and who had not been attacked were in various states of distress in the early hours. Some had been awake when the emergency calls were made. Some had been woken by the sounds and voices in the corridor. Some had come out of their rooms to find the building full of police and paramedics and the particular organized chaos of an emergency response that is simultaneously a crime scene operation. They had been moved to a common area, kept together. Their initial accounts taken by officers who were trying to gather information while also managing the acute human crisis of 30-plus young women discovering that 2 of their housemates were dead and 2 more were being taken to hospital. The accounts were fragmentary and varied in the way that witness accounts always are in the immediate aftermath of a traumatic event. People remembered different things. People heard different sounds or did not hear sounds they later thought they should have heard. The general picture that emerged from those first interviews was of a house that had been fully asleep at the time of the attacks, that had not registered anything unusual until it was already over, and that had been given no warning that anything was wrong until the damage had been done, except for Nita Neary. Her account was taken in those early morning hours and was noted immediately as significant. She had seen him, not in a room, not from behind, not at a distance that made identification uncertain. She had seen his profile in the light of the entrance hallway, his face partially obscured by the dark cap he wore, the object in his hand, the speed of his movement toward the door and out of it. She was precise about what she'd seen and consistent in her description. The investigators who took her statement recognized what they had. Not a complete identification, not yet, but a witness account with specificity and coherence that would matter later. The investigation, in those first hours, had no suspect. There was no name. There was no connection visible to anyone in Tallahassee or Leon County on the morning of January 16th between what had happened in the Chi Omega house and the man registered as Chris Hargin in a rooming house on West College Avenue. There was no connection visible between the Chi Omega murders and the escaped Colorado prisoner whose name was circulating in law enforcement bulletins from the Rocky Mountain region. Those connections would take weeks to assemble, and some of them would not become clear until after his arrest in Pensacola. The investigation in those first days was working from the physical evidence of 2 scenes, from the accounts of survivors and witnesses, and from the absence of a known suspect. The campus community processed the news through the day of January 16th in the way that contained communities process catastrophic news, imperfectly, collectively, and with a specific kind of fear that comes from the knowledge that the violence happened very close to home and has not been resolved. Florida State University had more than 20,000 students in the spring of 1978. The sorority houses and dormitories and off-campus apartments that made up the residential world of that student population were suddenly understood to be less secure than they had seemed the previous morning. The doors that had been left unlocked or carelessly latched, the windows that had been pushed up rather than properly closed, the habits of a campus community that had never had particular reason to feel threatened. All of those habits came into sharp focus on January 16th. The university administration responded. Security personnel were increased on campus. The sorority houses on Sorority Row were advised on their entry procedures. The campus emergency system was examined for its adequacy. These responses were appropriate and sincere, and they also had the slightly desperate quality of measures taken after the fact of a community trying to make itself secure against a threat it did not yet understand. The investigation moved forward through the week. Evidence was sent for analysis. Additional interviews were conducted with Chi Omega members and with residents of the streets around the house. The Dunwoody street assault was formally connected to the Chi Omega events by investigators who recognized in the pattern of the two scenes the signature of a single person working through a single night in the same neighborhood. The combined weight of the two scenes, 5 victims, 2 deaths, 3 survivors with serious injuries, all within walking distance of one another in the same 3-hour window, gave the investigation a scale that brought resources from beyond Tallahassee. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement became involved. The investigation acquired the structure of a major case, a dedicated task force, a formal evidence tracking system, a coordinated approach to the forensic material from both scenes. The bite mark evidence from Lisa Levy's body became a priority. Investigators understood that if they could identify a suspect, the bite mark offered the possibility of a comparison that could place that suspect at the scene with a degree of physical specificity that was rare in criminal evidence. For now, the suspect was unknown. The Chi Omega house was released back to its administration after the investigation had taken what it needed from the interior. The women who lived there were given the choice of returning or making other arrangements. Many made other arrangements. The house that had been their home continued to exist as a building on Sorority Row, but its character had been altered in the way that places where terrible things have happened are always altered, not in their physical structure, but in the feeling of moving through them, the knowledge that sits in the walls and the corridors and the rooms and does not leave. Margaret Bowman was buried in St. Petersburg. Her family received her and grieved her in the private way that families grieve. Apart from the investigation and apart from the campus community, and apart from the news coverage that was already beginning to accumulate around the case. She had been 21 years old, a junior at Florida State, a young woman in the middle of her education and her life. The semester she had returned to complete in January would have ended in May. She had not had the chance to finish it. Lisa Levy was also buried in St. Petersburg. She had been 20 years old. The same city had given both women to the same university and the same sorority house and the same night. Their families did not know one another in any deep way, but grief is not a private possession. It spreads into the community that surrounds the people who hold it, and it spread now through the St. Petersburg families and the Tallahassee campus and the wider network of people who had known either woman. In a room on West College Avenue, the man registered as Chris Hagan had not yet left Tallahassee. He remained in the neighborhood. He walked its streets. He ate at the cheap places near the campus. He read the news coverage of the Chi Omega murders in the way that anyone in Tallahassee was reading it in those days, as the dominant story of the local environment, present in every conversation and on every available surface. He knew what had happened because he had done it, and he read about it in the newspaper and watched the investigation's public face develop in the days after January 15th, and he stayed in the city where he had done it, in the room he had rented under a false name, for another 3 weeks. The investigation did not find him in that time. He was there, in the neighborhood, present and unremarkable. He was Chris Hagan, a young man without obvious employment, paying his rent and moving through the streets of the college town in the way that many such men moved through many such towns in 1978 without attracting particular attention. The investigation was looking for a pattern, a connection, a name that would attach itself to the evidence. It had not yet found one. Outside, the January light continued its pale and insufficient effort over the Tallahassee streets. The live oaks stood in it. The police tape came down from the Chi Omega house, and the building resumed its exterior normalcy, while its interior remained changed. The investigation deepened its work in the direction of the physical evidence, toward the bite mark and the pantyhose mask and the trace materials from 2 separate scenes. The name it was looking for was in the building on West College Avenue. Etchpick. Chapter 9. The Witness at the Door. Tispick. Nita Neary had come home late. She had been out with her boyfriend, and the evening had run past the hour at which most of the Chiamega house had gone to sleep. She came through the front door of the sorority house sometime around 3 in the morning, stepping into the entrance hallway from the cold of the January night outside, carrying her things, moving with the quiet consideration of someone entering a sleeping house at an hour when consideration is required. She saw him at the moment she came through the door. He was already in motion, already turning toward the exit, already at the point in his movement through the house where the front door was the next thing between him and the outside. He was wearing a dark wool cap pulled low. He was wearing a jacket or coat, dark in colour. He was carrying something along the length of his right leg, held down and close to his body, a log or thick stick of some kind, roughly 1.5 feet in length. He moved quickly, with the contained urgency of someone who has somewhere to be immediately. He pushed through the front door and was gone. The entire encounter lasted only a few seconds. Nita Neary stood in the entrance hallway after he left. The door swung back toward its frame. The hallway was empty. The house was quiet around her, or seemed quiet, in the way that a house in which terrible things have just finished happening can seem quiet because the violence is over and the sleeping and the dead are all still. She had not heard anything unusual from outside while she was approaching the building. She had not seen anyone on the street in front of the house. The encounter at the door had been brief and without context. A man she did not recognize, moving out of the building with purpose in the middle of the night. She did not know what she had seen. She knew that it was strange, and that the strangeness of it did not resolve into anything innocent. A man she did not recognize, leaving the sorority house through the front door at 3 in the morning, carrying what appeared to be a weapon. She stood in the hallway and processed this for a moment, and then she went upstairs. What she found upstairs transformed the fleeting strangeness of what she had seen at the door into something that would define the next decade of her life. She woke her roommate. Her roommate woke others. The calls were made. The police came. And in the early morning hours, while the building was filling with investigators and the survivors were being taken to the hospital and the dead were being documented by the medical examiner, Nita Neary sat and gave her account to the officers who needed to hear it. She was precise. She had been returning from an evening out and was not, at the moment she came through the door, in any particular state of distress or impairment. She had been alert. The light in the entrance hallway, while not bright, was sufficient for her to see the person in front of her clearly enough to register the details she reported: the dark cap, the profile of his face as he turned toward the door, the dark Epaus as he turned toward the door, the jacket, the object in his hand. She had not seen him full-faced. She had seen his profile, his left side, the angle of his face as he turned away from her toward the exit. It was not a complete view. But it was a view, and she had held it, and she could describe what she had seen with a specificity that the investigators recognized as valuable. The investigators who took her initial statement asked her to describe the object the man had been carrying. She described it as a log or thick stick, something roughly cylindrical, dark in colour, perhaps 18 inches long, held along the leg in a way that suggested he wanted it to be unobtrusive. This description aligned with the forensic evidence from the rooms upstairs, with the injuries sustained by Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner, and with the physical properties of whatever instrument had been used to strike the victims. The investigators were careful not to suggest details to her, or to frame questions in ways that would shape her answers. They asked what she had seen, and she told them, and what she told them fit the physical record in a way that strengthened rather than complicated the investigation's emerging picture of the night. In the days and weeks that followed, she would be asked to describe what she had seen many times. She would be asked by investigators, by attorneys, by the structures of legal process that build themselves around a case as it moves from crime scene to prosecution. Each time her account was consistent in its essential details. The dark cap, the profile, the object in his hand, the speed of his exit. She would also be shown photographs. At some point after Bundy's arrest in Pensacola in February, when his name had been connected to the Tallahassee investigation, and when the accumulated evidence from the Chiamega house and the Dunwoody Street apartment was being assembled into a prosecutable case, Nita Neary was shown photographic arrays that included his image. She identified the silhouette of the figure she had seen at the door as consistent with Bundy's profile. The identification was not of the absolute certainty that a full-face photograph viewed in good light would have permitted, but it was consistent, and consistency across multiple viewings by the same witness, whose original account had been given before any suspect was identified, carried its own weight. At trial, she would testify in the courtroom. The trial of Theodore Bundy for the Chi Omega murders took place in the summer of 1979 in Orlando, Florida, having been moved there from Tallahassee on a change of venue. It was a trial that drew enormous public attention and that was, in several of its aspects, unprecedented in the American legal experience of the time. Bundy chose to act as his own co-counsel, a decision that gave him a formal role in the proceedings and that he used with the particular combination of legal knowledge and performance that had characterized his behavior in his Colorado proceedings. The courtroom was televised in part, which was itself a novelty, and the coverage of the trial brought the case to a national audience that had been following it since the January murders with varying degrees of understanding of the actual evidence. Nita Neary took the stand and testified about what she had seen at the front door of the Chi Omega house in the early morning of January 15, 1978. She described the cap, the profile, the object in his hand, the speed of his exit. She identified the silhouette she had seen as consistent with Bundy's. She was cross-examined. Bundy participated in that cross-examination. The man she had seen leaving the house standing in the courtroom and questioning her about the night she had come home and found him in her doorway. She held. Her account did not change. The details she offered in cross-examination were the same details she had given on the morning of January 16th in the early hours of a Florida winter morning, while the building around her was still processing what had happened in its rooms. She had seen what she had seen. She said so. The bite mark evidence was the other pillar of the physical case. Dr. Absent, Richard Suaran, the forensic odontologist, testified about the bite mark photographed on Lisa Levy's body and about his comparison of that mark with the dental impressions taken from Bundy while he was in custody. The comparison, conducted using the photographs of the wound and the dental molds, showed a match between the distinctive characteristics of Bundy's teeth, including an irregular chipping and alignment that was individual to him, and the mark left in the tissue of Lisa Levy's body. The presentation of this evidence to the jury, including enlarged photographs of both the wound and the dental impressions displayed side by side, was considered by legal observers to be among the most effective pieces of forensic testimony in the case. Bundy disputed the bite mark evidence. He disputed Nita Neary's identification. He disputed the forensic record of the two scenes in a variety of ways throughout the trial, employing the legal knowledge he had and the familiarity with courtroom procedure that his years of involvement in his own cases had given him. He was not, in the conventional sense, an unprepared or unsophisticated defendant. He understood what the evidence against him was, and he worked against it with the tools available to him. The jury deliberated for less than 7 hours. On July 24, 1979, they returned a verdict of guilty on all counts related to the Chi Omega murders, the first-degree murders of Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy, and the attempted murders of Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner. The sentencing hearing that followed produced a recommendation of death. Judge Edward Cowart sentenced Bundy to death in the electric chair for each of the two murders. He also delivered from the bench a statement that has been quoted many times in the years since, in which he told Bundy that he was a bright young man who had wasted himself and that it was a tragedy. The statement has attracted various interpretations. What is less often noted is what came before and after it, the formal declaration of a sentence of death, pronounced twice, once for each woman who had died in the Chi Omega house on the night of January 15th. Bundy received the sentence with the surface composure that had characterized much of his courtroom behavior. He had been performing composure for a long time by then, in courtrooms in Utah and Colorado, and now Florida, and the performance was practiced and held. Whether it held in the interior as well is not knowable. What is knowable is the record, the verdict, the sentence, the two names to which it was attached. Margaret Bowman, Lisa Levy. Nita Neary had come home late one night and walked through her own front door and seen the man who killed them. She had remembered what she saw. She had said what she remembered, clearly and consistently, every time she was asked. In a case built substantially on forensic evidence of the kind that juries in 1979 were still learning to evaluate and trust, her account of those few seconds in the entrance hallway of the Chi Omega house added something that physical evidence alone cannot always supply: the presence of a human witness who stood in the same room as the man, at the moment he was leaving what he had done, and looked at his face. The courtroom was quiet when she finished testifying. Outside the courthouse in Orlando, the Florida summer pressed down with its particular weight of heat and humidity, the air thick and still in the way of Florida in July, the sun high and flat and without mercy. The live oaks of Tallahassee were 6 months and 200 miles away. The sorority house on Sorority Row stood in the summer heat behind its ordinary exterior, its semester-long finished, its rooms empty for the summer, its corridors quiet, in the way that institutional buildings are quiet when they are between their populations of people. In the courtroom, the record continued to be made. Chapter 10. Lake City. Lake City, Florida, is a small city in Columbia County, in the northern interior of the state, about 100 miles east of Tallahassee along Interstate 10. It sits in the flatland country of North Florida, among pine forests and palmetto scrub and the dark, slow rivers that run through limestone country toward the Gulf or the Atlantic, depending on which watershed they find themselves in. The Swanee River passes not far to the west of it. The Ichetney runs clear and cold from its spring head a few miles south. The town itself has the character of a county seat in the interior south, a central commercial district, a courthouse, churches, schools, the neighborhoods that spread from the center in the way of modest American towns where space is not a constraint and the houses have yards. Lake City Junior High School sat within the ordinary geography of the town. It was a public school, part of the Columbia County school system, housing the students who were between the elementary years and the high school, the 12 and 13 and 14-year-olds who were in the middle passage of their education, and whose daily lives were defined by the rhythms of a school week in a small Florida city, the bus routes, the class schedules, the lunch periods, the social world of a junior high, the walk home in the afternoon through streets that everyone in town knew by name. Kimberly Leach was 12 years old. She had been born on January 12, 1966, which meant that she had turned 12 just 4 weeks before February 9, 1978. She was in the 8th grade at Lake City Junior High School. She lived with her family in Lake City, in the way that children in small cities live, embedded in a known geography of home and school and neighborhood, moving through the familiar streets and routes of a place that was entirely her own, whose every storefront and corner and classroom she knew. She was, by the accounts of those who knew her, a normal 12-year-old, with the specific enthusiasms and social concerns and daily preoccupations of a girl that age in that place and time. She was not a public figure. She was not a name that anyone outside Columbia County would have known before February 9, 1978. That morning was an ordinary school day. The students arrived at Lake City Junior High by bus and on foot in the way of school mornings everywhere. The particular morning energy of a building filling with young people who are simultaneously tired and in motion. The classes began. The morning proceeded in its institutional way, teachers moving through their subject matter, students at their desks in the specific managed restlessness of adolescent academic life. Kimberly Leach left the school building at some point during the school day. The specific circumstances of her departure have been examined in detail, and what is established is that she was seen leaving the school's campus area. She had gone back to retrieve something she had forgotten, a purse or bag left at another location on the school grounds. She was moving between buildings or toward the edge of the school property when she encountered a man in a vehicle who spoke to her. Witnesses near the school that morning reported seeing a man approach a young girl near the campus. One witness described a man in a white van speaking to a young girl. Another reported seeing what appeared to be a child being led away by an adult. The accounts were not immediately assembled into a coherent picture of an abduction. In a school environment, adults sometimes speak to students for legitimate reasons. A child walking with an adult does not automatically announce danger. The witnesses who saw something that morning did not know, at the moment they saw it, that what they were watching was the beginning of the last movement to the disappearance. Kimberly Leach did not return to her classes. When she was not present at subsequent classes, the school's systems for tracking student attendance eventually registered her absence. By the afternoon of February 9th, the awareness that she was missing had reached her family and then the Columbia County Sheriff's Department. The search that began that afternoon and continued into the following days covered the area around the school and the streets of Lake City with the thorough desperation of a search for a missing child in a community where such a thing had never happened before and where the disappearance of a 12-year-old from a school campus had no precedent that anyone in the community could draw on for guidance. They did not find her. He had been in Lake City because he was moving. The 3 weeks between the Chiamega murders on January 15th and his departure from Tallahassee had ended when the pressure of remaining in the same city where a major murder investigation was underway became greater than whatever had kept him there. He had left Tallahassee and moved east along Interstate 10 in the first days of February. He had a stolen vehicle, a white Dodge van that he had taken from the Florida State campus. He was using it to move through the panhandle in northern Florida interior. stopping in communities along the route, present in gas stations and fast food restaurants, and the ordinary wayside infrastructure of American highway travel without drawing particular attention. Lake City was on the route. The deliberate and predatory nature of what he did on the morning of February 9th is established by the physical evidence and by what followed it. He approached a child on a school campus, which required entering the zone around a school in daylight, which required a level of calculation about risk and attention that told its own story about the state he was in by that point in February 1978. He had been free for 40 days. He had committed murders in Tallahassee that had generated a major investigation. He had remained in Tallahassee for weeks after doing it. He was now moving through rural North Florida in a stolen van, and he took a child from a school campus in a small city where everyone knew the streets and where an unfamiliar vehicle and an unfamiliar adult would have been, in different circumstances, immediately noticeable. He drove north and west from Lake City after taking Kimberly Leach from the school grounds. What happened to her in the hours that followed her abduction is established by the physical evidence recovered with her remains and by the forensic examination of those remains. She was killed. The exact circumstances of her death and the sequence of events between her abduction and her death are known to investigators and were presented at trial, but the specific details belong to the clinical record of the case and to the testimony of the medical examiner who examined her remains, and they are not details that require exhaustive rendering here. She was 12 years old. She had turned 12 4 weeks earlier. She had left her classroom to retrieve something she had forgotten. Her remains were found on April 7th, 1978, in a shed on land associated with a pig farm near the Suwannee River in Suwannee County, approximately 35 miles west of Lake City, along the route that Interstate 10 traces through the North Florida pine country. The location was remote from the roads and from any inhabited structure. The shed itself was a deteriorated outbuilding in a part of the county where such structures exist at the margins of agricultural land, weathered and abandoned, the kind of building that a rural landscape accumulates over generations of farming and that becomes invisible through familiarity to anyone who passes it regularly. She had been there for nearly 2 months. The discovery of her remains was made by investigators who had been working the case since February, following the route of the stolen van and the geography of possible concealment sites along that route. The van had been identified relatively quickly after Bundy's arrest on February 15th, and the trajectory of his movement from Tallahassee through Lake City and toward Pensacola gave the investigation a corridor to search. The shed in Suwannee County was within that corridor. The Columbia County community processed her death in the way that small communities process the murder of a child, not quietly and not quietly, and not in any way that returned to ordinary. The school she had attended, the streets she had walked, the family that had expected her home from school on the afternoon of February 9th. All of those things continued in the way that things continue, carrying what they now carried. Her parents and her brother and the wider family network that surrounds a child of 12 in a community like Lake City held a grief that was specific to them and that no investigation, however thorough, and no trial, however justified in its outcome, could address. The case against Bundy for the murder of Kimberly Leach was built from multiple streams of evidence. The stolen white van was connected to the abduction through witness accounts from the area around Lake City Junior High School. Fibers recovered from the van matched fibers found with her remains. A witness who had seen Bundy near Lake City on the morning of February 9th provided a description that was consistent with his appearance. The physical evidence from the site where her remains were found connected the location to his movements along the Interstate 10 corridor. A witness named Clarence Anderson had seen a man matching Bundy's description near the school on the morning of the abduction. A fire station cook named Danny Patchen had noted the suspicious behavior of a man in a white van near the school and had written down part of the vehicle's license plate number. That partial plate number, when followed by investigators after Bundy's arrest, traced back to the stolen van he had been using. The Lake City investigation added a third Florida murder charge to the cases building against him in Tallahassee. It was, in several respects, the charge that generated the most public and legal weight. Not because a 12-year-old is worth more than a 20-year-old or a 21-year-old, but because the visible plainness of the crime. A child taken from a school in a small town on a weekday morning in February carried a clarity that required no forensic complexity to understand. He had taken a child from her school. She was 12 years old. He killed her and left her in a shed in the pine country of North Florida, and she lay there through the rest of February and all of March and into April before she was found. The The pine forests of Suwannee County were quiet through those weeks, in the way that the North Florida interior is quiet in winter and early spring, when the tourist traffic that fills the coastal areas has not yet penetrated the interior, and the land holds its own company of birds and water, and the slow growth of the palmetto under the pine canopy. The shed stood in that landscape, and the landscape was indifferent to it, as landscape is always indifferent to what human beings do and leave and hide within it. The Suwannee River moved through its channel to the west, dark and slow and tannin-stained the colour of old tea, over its limestone bed, past the cypress knees and the riverbanks where the ferns grew thick in the damp, carrying the water from its headwaters in the Okefenokee swamp, all the way to the Gulf of Mexico swamp, all the way to the Gulf of Mexico, with the calm impersonal industry of a river that has been doing the same thing for longer than anyone has been watching it. It moved past the county where Kimberly Leach had been left, and it did not stop, and it did not mark the place. And when the investigators finally found her in April and the location became part of the record and the evidence, the river was still moving south in the same direction it had always moved, through the same pine country, under the same flat North Florida sky. She had been 12 years old. She had turned 12 4 weeks before he took her. That is what the record holds. Chapter 11. A Stolen Car in Pensacola. Taftapla. The last weeks of his time as a free man did not look like freedom in any meaningful sense. He had left Tallahassee sometime in the first days of February 1978, moving east along Interstate 10 through the pine country of the Florida Panhandle with the particular forward motion of someone who understands that remaining in one place has become untenable. The investigation into the Chi Omega murders was growing. His name was not yet attached to it in any way that Tallahassee law enforcement had established, but the weight of a major murder investigation operating in the same city where he was living on a false name and stolen money was a weight that even a person of considerable capacity for self-possession would have found difficult to sustain indefinitely. He left. He was driving a stolen orange Volkswagen Beetle. He had taken it from the Florida State University campus at some point before his departure from Tallahassee. The car was small and conspicuous in the way that a brightly coloured vehicle is conspicuous, but it ran, and it was not immediately connected to him by name, and for the purposes of putting distance between himself and the Chi Omega investigation, it served. He moved east and then north and then west, tracing a route through the North Florida interior that took him through Lake City on February 9th, and then continued into the Panhandle. After Lake City, he moved through the pine country in the direction of Pensacola, which sits at the far western edge of the Florida Panhandle, at the point where the state narrows to its slenderest margin between the Alabama border and the Gulf of Mexico. Pensacola was a navy town and a modest city, with a beach community along its barrier island and a working harbour, and the particular social mixture of a city that has a large military population and a civilian economy built around it. It was not a place he had any connection to. It was simply further west, further from Tallahassee, further from the investigation that was building behind him. He stayed in Pensacola for several days. He was running low on money, as he had been running low on money for most of his time in Florida. He had been eating badly and sleeping in the car on some nights, or in cheap accommodation where it was available, and where a man paying cash without identification could still find a room. He was 47 days out from the Garfield County Jail, 47 days since the crawl space in the Colorado winter and the long road south. The original fuel of that escape, the intensity of purpose that had carried him through the ceiling and across the American interior and into Tallahassee, had long since burned through. What was left was the sustained effort of a person trying to remain invisible, in a state that was actively looking for the man who had killed 2 women in a sorority house and taken a child from a school in Lake City. Even if that state did not yet know, those 3 crimes were the work of the same person, or that the person in question was an escaped Colorado prisoner whose name was Theodore Bundy. He stole food. He stole other things. He moved through Pensacola with the reduced and opportunistic logic of someone whose resources have reached their minimum and who is no longer planning in any real sense, only continuing. The white Dodge van he had used in Lake City had been abandoned or left somewhere along the route. He was in the orange Volkswagen. In the early morning hours of February 15, 1978, Officer David Lee of the Pensacola Police Department was on patrol in the eastern residential sections of the city. It was around 1 in the morning. The streets were quiet in the way of a mid-sized city in the deep of the night. A few vehicles moving, the occasional light in a window, the empty parking lots of closed businesses holding their square pools of lamplight over nothing. Officer Lee noticed the orange Volkswagen moving through the neighborhood. There was nothing dramatically unusual about a Volkswagen on a residential street at 1 in the morning, but something in its movement or position prompted him to run the plates. The plates came back stolen. He activated his emergency equipment and pulled the vehicle over. The man in the driver's seat gave his name as Kenneth Misner. Kenneth Misner was a real person, a Florida State University student whose identity Bundy had appropriated at some point during his time in Tallahassee, using the name and associated identification to present himself as someone with a legitimate Florida connection. He had documents in that name. The name itself was plausible and exceptional, the name of a young man who had every reason to be driving in Florida in February. Officer Lee was not immediately satisfied. The stolen plates created an obligation to investigate further, and the man in the driver's seat, while calm on the surface in the practiced way that had served him in many encounters with authority over many years, did not fully resolve the situation by producing a name. Lee asked him to step out of the vehicle. What happened next was brief and violent. Bundy attacked Officer Lee. The struggle was sudden and physical, and took the encounter from a routine traffic stop into a different category in the span of seconds. He broke away from Lee and ran into the dark of the residential neighborhood, leaving the car and the officer behind him, heading into the yards and shadows of the sleeping streets with whatever remained of his capacity for forward motion. He did not get far. Officer Lee, who had been knocked down in the struggle but not incapacitated, called for assistance and gave pursuit. Additional officers arrived quickly. The neighborhood was not large, and the streets were empty enough that a running man was not difficult to track. He was found within a short distance, on the ground in one of the residential yards near where he had left the car, exhausted and no longer running, in the way of a person whose body has finally spent the last of what it had. He was handcuffed and taken into custody. He gave the name Kenneth Misner again at the Pensacola police station. He maintained it through the initial processing. The officers who had him were treating the arrest as what it appeared to be on its surface, a man driving a stolen vehicle who had assaulted a police officer and fled. These were serious enough charges on their own. The identity question, the question of who the man giving the name Kenneth Misner actually was, would take a few more hours to resolve. It resolved when investigators ran more thorough checks, and when Bundy, in the particular way of someone who has been maintaining a performance for a very long time and has reached the end of his ability to sustain it, eventually told them his real name. Theodore Bundy. The name went into the system. The system returned what it held. The escaped Colorado prisoner, wanted since December 30th on the original charges in the Karen Campbell murder case and on the escape charges, a man for whom law enforcement agencies from Colorado through the American interior had been looking for 6 weeks. The connection to Florida, to Tallahassee, to the Chi Omega murders and the disappearance of Kimberly Leach from Lake City was not made in the first hours of his detention in Pensacola. It was made over the following days, as investigators from Leon County and from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement and from Columbia County began to piece together a timeline that placed a man matching his description in Tallahassee during the week surrounding January 15th, and in Lake City on the morning of February 9th, and on the Interstate 10 corridor between those two events. The white Dodge van was traced. The fiber evidence began to be assembled. The stolen Volkswagen was examined for whatever it held. The name Kenneth Misner was traced back to the Florida State student whose identity had been used, and that trail led back to Tallahassee, and to the rooming house on West College Avenue, and to the room that had been rented to a man calling himself Chris Hagen. The room had been vacated, its contents modest and unrevealing, but the connection between the false name and the address and the geography of the Chi Omega murders was a connection that investigators were now in a position to examine. The Colorado authorities were notified immediately. The Pitkin County case and the Garfield County escape were already on the books, already active, already the basis for the nationwide alert that had been running since January 1st. The Florida arrest closed the loop on the fugitive case. It also opened the much larger and more complex set of questions about what he'd done during his 47 days in Florida, and about what had happened in those Florida cases, and about whether the man in custody in Pensacola was the man responsible for the deaths of Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy and the disappearance of Kimberly Leach. The investigators believed he was. The work of proving it, in the specific and demanding terms that the American legal system requires, still lay ahead. he was held in the Escambia County Jail in Pensacola, while the jurisdictional and investigative questions were sorted. He was cooperative in some respects and not in others, in the selective and calculated way that had characterized his engagement with law enforcement throughout his years of involvement with the legal system. He was aware of his situation. He understood what was being assembled around him. He had been through courtrooms and hearings and legal proceedings in Utah and Colorado, and he understood the mechanics of what came next. The mechanics of what came next were considerable. In Leon County and in Columbia County, the investigations that had been running since January and February were now oriented around a named suspect in custody. The physical evidence from both scenes, the bite mark, the fiber evidence, the witness accounts from the school in Lake City and from the neighborhood around the Chi Omega house, was being examined in the context of the man who had been driving a stolen orange Volkswagen through a residential neighborhood in Pensacola at 1 in the morning on February 15, 1978. Outside the Escambia County Jail, Pensacola went about its business in the February morning. The Gulf lay to the south, its water grey-green in the winter light, its beaches empty at this hour and this season. The harbour was active with its ordinary commercial traffic. The military installations that defined so much of the city's economy maintained their routines. The residential neighbourhoods where the orange Volkswagen had been stopped, where Officer Lee had been attacked and where a man had run across dark yards until he could not run anymore, were quiet again in the way of neighbourhoods that return quickly to their ordinary rhythms after the emergency vehicles have gone. He sat in a cell in the Escambia County facility. The cell was a cell, not meaningfully different from the cells in Utah and Colorado that he had occupied before. A bed, walls, a door, a ceiling. He had looked at the ceilings of cells before with a specific purpose. There is no record that he looked at this one the same way. He had been free for 47 days. In those 47 days he had travelled from a Colorado canyon through the American winter to the Gulf Coast of Florida, had lived under a false name in a college town, had committed murders that killed 2 women and injured 2 more in a single night, had taken a 12-year-old child from a school campus in a small city, and had moved through the pine country of North Florida until a police officer running a plate in the early morning hours of a February night had found him in a stolen car and a residential street in Pensacola, exhausted and at the end of his capacity to continue. The cell held him. The investigation held his name. Outside, the Gulf of Mexico moved against its barrier island beaches in the way it has always moved, in long, slow swells that reach the shore and spend themselves in white water and foam against the pale sand, indifferent to the city behind the dunes, indifferent to the jail inside the city, indifferent to the man inside the jail, indifferent to everything in the way of very large bodies of water that have been in motion for longer than anyone has been watching them. The water moved. The investigation moved with it. Uptiff. Chapter 12. The Chair, Teff. The trials came in 2 separate movements, spaced across the better part of a year. The first was for the Chi Omega murders. Because of the scale of the pre-trial publicity in Tallahassee and throughout Leon County, the case was moved on a change of venue to Miami and then ultimately tried in Orlando in the summer of 1979. Judge Edward Cowart of the Dade County Circuit Court presided. The trial began in June and ran through the heat of a central Florida summer, through the particular oppressive heat of Orlando in July, when the air outside the courthouse was thick and wet, and the shade of the live oaks gave only shade, of the live oaks gave only partial relief, and the interior of the courtroom held the slightly unreal atmosphere of an air-conditioned space sealed against the intensity of what was happening outside. The courtroom was televised in part. This was a relative novelty in 1979, and it gave the proceedings a national audience that followed them with a mixture of legal interest and something harder to name, the specific fascination of a public that had been reading about Theodore Bundy since his first arrest in Utah in 1975, and that was now watching him in a Florida courtroom, representing himself in part, cross-examining witnesses, addressing the judge in the composed and articulate manner that had characterized his public behavior for years. He sat at the defense table and participated in his own trial as co-counsel. He had insisted on this arrangement. It gave him standing in the courtroom that a defendant without legal training would not have had, and he used it in the way that someone with his particular combination of legal knowledge and performance capability would use it, methodically, attentively, and with a visible composure that the public audience found alternately impressive and deeply unsettling depending on what they understood about the man behind it. The state of Florida built its case on several streams of evidence. Nita Neary testified about what she had seen at the front door of the Chi Omega house in the early hours of January 15th, 1978. She had come home late and found him leaving. She had seen his profile in the light of the entrance hallway, his dark cap, the object in his hand. She identified that profile as consistent with Bundy. Her testimony was the human anchor of the case, the account of a witness who had been physically present at the moment of his departure from the scene, and who had held and accurately reported what she saw across all the months between the night itself and the summer of the trial. Dr. Nosti and Ham. Richard Surin presented the bite mark evidence. He had examined the photographs taken by the Leon County medical examiner of the bite mark inflicted on Lisa Levy's body, and he had compared those photographs against the dental impressions taken from Bundy while he was in custody. What he presented to the jury was a comparison between the wound and the teeth that had made it. Bundy's dentition was irregular in specific and identifiable ways, a chipping pattern, an alignment, a combination of characteristics that made his dental profile individual to him in the way that all such profiles are individual. The bite mark in the photographs showed those same characteristics. Sawiron explained the comparison in terms accessible to the jury, using enlarged visual displays that placed the wound and the dental mold in proximity on the same image, and his conclusion was that the mark had been made by Bundy's teeth. The defense challenged this evidence. It challenged Nita Neary's identification. It challenged the physical record of both scenes in a variety of ways across the weeks of the trial. The challenge was not without some technical merit in the specific area of bite mark analysis, which was and has remained a contested field within forensic science. The question of the absolute reliability of dental comparison evidence has been examined seriously in subsequent decades, and the field has developed more rigorous standards as a result. The jury weighed what was in front of them. They deliberated for less than 7 hours. On July 24, 1979, they returned a verdict of guilty on all counts. The murders of Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy. The attempted murders of Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner. All guilty. The sentencing hearing followed, and the jury recommended death for each of the 2 murders. Judge Cowart accepted the recommendation. He sentenced Theodore Bundy to death in the electric chair, twice, once for each woman. He also said something from the bench before pronouncing the sentence that has been repeated many times in the years since. He told Bundy that he was a bright young man, that it was a tragedy, that in a different world he might have made a good lawyer. The words have been analysed for what they say about the era's particular discomfort with the fact of an educated, well-spoken white man being sentenced to death, about the way such men were sometimes regarded as more complicated tragedies than the evidence of their actions supported. What Cowart said before and after those words was the death sentence itself, spoken with the formality of the law, attached to the names of the 2 women who had died in the Chi Omega house. The second trial was in Orlando as well, beginning in January 1980. It concerned Kimberly Leach. The Kimberly Leach trial was, in some respects, a more straightforward evidentiary proceeding than the Chi Omega trial. The fibre evidence connecting the stolen white Dodge van to the location where her remains had been found was physical and specific. The witness accounts from the area around Lake City Junior High School placed a man matching Bundy's description in the vicinity of the school on the morning of February 9th. The partial license plate number recorded by the fire station cook in Lake City traced back to the stolen van. The geography of his movements, reconstructed from the accumulated evidence of his 47 days in Florida, placed him on the specific route between Tallahassee and Lake City and onward toward Pensacola. He was convicted of the murder of Kimberly Leach on February 7, 1980. He was sentenced to death a 3rd time. The years between the convictions and the execution were occupied with appeals. The American capital punishment system in the 1980s was not a rapid mechanism. Appeals moved through the state and federal courts in the careful and procedurally complex way of a legal architecture designed to ensure that death sentences were not carried out without exhaustive review. Bundy's legal team, and Bundy himself in his periodic capacity as a participant in his own defense, pursued every available avenue. The appeals were not frivolous. Some raised legitimate questions about trial procedure and about the evidentiary standards applied to the bite mark evidence in particular. The courts examined those questions and ruled on them, and the rulings went against him. The decade passed. He spent it at Florida State Prison in Stark, Florida, a flat and unlovely town in the north-central interior of the state, surrounded by the same pine and palmetto scrub that covers much of that part of Florida, without the charm of the river country to the west or the coastal light of the beaches to the east. The prison sat in that landscape with the specific bleakness of a maximum security institution designed entirely around the function of confinement, without grace notes, without the accumulated historical character that old buildings sometimes carry, simply functional and final. He continued to attract attention. Writers and journalists and criminologists sought access to him, and some received it. He spoke about himself and about the nature of what he had done in ways that were calculating in their selectivity, forthcoming about certain things, evasive about others, framing his own history in ways that were useful to him in the moment and that shifted when the moment changed. He was not, in these interviews and exchanges, providing genuine illumination. He was managing the version of himself that reached the outside world with the same attention he had brought to every other kind of management throughout his life. In the days and hours before his execution, that changed. As the final appeals were denied and the execution date of January 24, 1989 became fixed and certain, he began to confess. He spoke to investigators from multiple states who had cases that had never been formally resolved, women who had been killed and whose cases had been attributed to him or suspected of being his work, but never proven to the legal standard required. He gave accounts of murders in Washington State, in Oregon, in Utah, in Colorado, in Idaho. He named locations where remains might be found. He described crimes with the specificity that only someone with direct knowledge of them could have supplied. He said he had killed 30 women. Investigators who studied his cases over the subsequent decades have believed the number was higher, possibly significantly higher, though the precise total has never been established with certainty. He confessed to the Chi Omega murders. He confessed to the murder of Kimberly Leach. The confessions were understood by investigators and observers at the time as partly genuine and partly a mechanism for delay. Each confession, each new piece of information offered to investigators, was potentially a reason to postpone the execution while the information was evaluated and followed up. He understood this. The investigators who sat with him in the final days understood it too. They took the information because the information mattered, because there were families in multiple states who had been waiting for years for any account of what had happened to women they had loved, and because whatever his motives, the information he was providing was accurate in ways that could be verified. The delay did not come. The confessions were received and the appeals were exhausted and the date held. January 24, 1989 was a Tuesday. The morning at Florida State Prison in Stark was the kind of North Florida winter morning that carries a genuine cold, not a deep cold, not a cold that would have registered as anything remarkable in Colorado or in the mountain states he had come from, but a real cold. The air sharp and clear under a sky that was pale blue and cloudless. Outside the prison perimeter, a crowd had gathered, the particular crowd that gathers outside prison walls on execution mornings in the American South. A mix of protesters on both sides of the capital punishment question, news media, and people whose presence there was harder to categorize, who had simply come because the occasion seemed to require witness of some kind. He was 42 years old. He had been in custody, with the interruptions of his 2 escapes, since 1975. He had spent more of his adult life inside institutions than outside them, which was not the frame through which he had presented himself to the world, but which was the simple arithmetic of the years. He had been born in November 1946 in Burlington, Vermont, had grown up in Washington State, had attended university, had worked in politics, had gone to law school. He had also killed women, beginning at some point in the early 1970s, across a period of years, and across a geography that stretched from the Pacific Northwest through Utah and Colorado to Florida. The electric chair at Florida State Prison was known, in the institution's dark vernacular, as Old Sparky. It was a wooden chair, built by the prison's own inmates in 1923, that had been in use for executions in Florida for more than 6 decades by the time Bundy was brought to it on the morning of January 24th. It sat in the execution chamber, a small room with white walls and a window through which witnesses could observe the proceedings, with the specific terrible plainness of a piece of furniture that has been used for exactly one purpose across many years. He was brought in. The preparations were made. The witnesses were in place behind the glass. Outside the prison, the crowd heard the announcement when it came. Some of them cheered, which troubled some observers and not others. The response dividing along lines that had less to do with Bundy specifically, and more to do with the deeper and unresolved American argument about the state's use of death as a legal instrument. Inside the execution chamber, the morning's business was concluded at 7 in the morning. Theodore Robert Bundy was pronounced dead. The crowd outside began to disperse. The news media filed their accounts. The officials of the Florida Department of Corrections completed their documentation. The witnesses were led out. The chamber was closed. In Tallahassee, the Chi Omega House stood on Sorority Row in the January morning. 11 years had passed since the night of January 15, 1978. The current students in the house had been children then, too young to hold any memory of it. The house had continued as a house continues, filling each year with new residents who brought their own lives and their own futures into it, who learned its floor plan and its peculiarities and its community rhythms, and then graduated and moved on and were replaced by others who did the same. The building held what happened in it the way all buildings hold what happens in them, invisibly, completely, in the walls and the floors and the air that does not remember and does not forget. In St. Petersburg, 2 families had lived for 11 years with the deaths of Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy. The execution did not return them. It marked something, in the way that legal conclusions mark things, but it did not return what January 15th had taken, which was the specific and irreplaceable fact of 2 young women who had been 21 and 20 years old in the first weeks of a spring semester, who had gone to a party on a Sunday evening and come home and gone to sleep in a house they had every reason to believe was safe. In Lake City, a family had lived for 11 years with the death of Kimberly Leach, who had been 12 years old, who had gone back to retrieve something she had left behind on a February morning and had not come home from school. The execution was carried out. The documentation was completed. The institutional processes that surround such events ran their course and concluded. At Florida State Prison in Stark, the January morning continued in the flat and ordinary way of a winter morning in the North Florida interior. The sky was clear. The pine trees along the prison perimeter stood in the pale light, still and dark-branched, holding their needles in the cold air. The road that runs through Stark was quiet at that hour, the town not yet fully awake, the traffic that would come later not yet moving. Somewhere north of the prison, the Suwannee River ran through the county where Kimberly Leach had been left in 1978, moving south through the limestone and the cypress and the old pine country toward the Gulf, the same river doing the same thing it had always done, carrying the dark water from the swamp to the sea, steady and patient and entirely indifferent to the human record through which it passes. The water moved south. The morning held its cold. The record closed. Thank you for listening, wherever you are tonight. The Bedside Historian will return.